Hello, my quilting friends! Welcome back to Grace Company's fantastic fall festival. My name is Leah Day, and this is the third video in our Basket Weave with QCT class. So this is a three-part series. Please watch the other videos so that you understand what we have stitched out up to this point. But in this video, we are going to talk about the borders. I have both squares in the borders, in the corners, and then I also have, of course, the long borders on the sides, top and bottom. So I'm going to walk you through how I'm going to stitch these different spaces step by step. So I've already fired up QCT 5 Beginnings, and I'm going to select and sew. We're going to place our blocks in the corners by selecting a design and placing it like a block. And I'm going to do number 2. So it's block 2 is the design that I'm using in the border corners. So I just tap on that and tap open. Okay, so I have lots of different ways that I can place this. My favorite is still that 4 points and stretch. So that way, if I have a little bit of distortion in that space, it's going to stretch it so it fits and fills the space nicely. So now I'm going to roll my machine over, and as you can see, I have switched to the ruler foot just because it's a little bit easier to describe what I'm doing. I'm going to line up so that the edges of the ruler foot are in line with the edges of that green square printed on my fabric panel. And the reason why I want to place my foot like this is because this ruler foot is exactly 1/2 inch around, meaning that from this edge to my needle, there is exactly 1/4 inch of space. That's exactly what I want. I like a little bit of a margin around the design. I think it looks really nice. So with my foot and needle in this position, I'm going to tap that first node, and you can see it's going to pop over here because it's on the far right side of the quilt. Now I'm going to roll over and position my foot in the next corner. That looks good. Tap on that corresponding node and then roll over to this corner. And just take your time with this placement. This is what guides the design. This is how you know how it's going to be placed. And you might be wondering why I'm so picky about this, why I bother with this 1/4 inch spacing and have mentioned that so many times. Well, the reason is if I go all the way out to the outer edge of the block, and I certainly could, and let's say line up with the corners, what if I overshot that a little bit? What if I got out here into this part of the border or out here over the edge of the quilt? That wouldn't look very nice. So I always err on the side of putting the design within the block that I'm stitching, so it's shrunk down ever so slightly, so I'm sure the design will be placed here in the block and not accidentally leak out into the border, into the outside of the quilt. Okay, so that's exactly how I want that placed. I'm just going to tap quilt. So we reach the next screen, and again, let's go over our settings. I pretty much set these settings and do not change them from design to design. I like my sewing speed on slow. I like a tie off stitch count of 2, and I like a micro stitch versus a back and forth. That's just my personal preference. I have both automatic bobbin pull and pause at trim lines checked, and I am stitching at 15 stitches per inch. Nice small stitches. Okay, let's pull our bobbin by tapping on the pull bobbin button. This is going to move the machine over, and I've already had it selected so that I don't get the warnings. I'm pretty much sure that my needle's always going to be up and not going to get me in trouble, but if you need those warnings, definitely keep those in place. Okay, so I tugged on my top thread, brought my bobbin thread up to the surface, and now I can just tap sew. And that's going to move the machine over and begin stitching. Now, whenever something stitches from the middle, you know that you're going to have that stitch back over that thread tail at some point. So usually what I'll do is I'll wait until the machine has stitched out and is a good distance away from that start point. So I think I need to let it go all the way around here, very close to that edge, and then I'm going to tap stop. And I'm going to show you how I tie off my thread tails. And actually, I just realized that my thread tails are way back here behind the machine. You can't see what I'm doing. So I'm going to hit sew. I'm going to let it continue to stitch out a little bit further. And then we're going to show you how to tie off your thread tails so they're nice and secure. So there we go. I let the design stitch just a little bit more, and now you can see what I'm doing. I have my top and bobbin thread tail here where we started quilting, and I'm going to tie those thread tails into an overhand knot. I basically make a loop with the thread tails, and I pass the tails through that loop, and then I'm going to be very careful as I tighten this down to about 1/8 of an inch from the quilt surface. And yes, this is a little tricky with the long arm in place right here. It does take a little bit of practice, but it's something that you can definitely get the hang of. So there we go. That is that knot. It's a little bit high for what I usually like, but that's okay. It's not the end of the world. The knot is really just to tie the two threads together so that way they don't unravel. Okay, so now I have a cheater needle. This is a needle with a groove in the eye, and I can insert this and I can thread it really easily on the quilt, on the frame. I don't have to thread it the traditional way. I can take the thread tails, hold them like this, and pop them into the eye, just like so. Now, it's pretty delicate. It likes to pull through, so make sure you have a little bit of slack here, and then pull it through. So there we go. That is how I tie off and bury my thread tails, nice and secure. And as I'm going to continue stitching the design, it's going to stitch over that area and secure it even more. So I'm just going to hit sew and let the design finish stitching. So now that we have quilted the corner blocks in our border, it's time to start talking about these long sides. So this is the long vertical side of the quilt. This is the longer side of the border that I have loaded in my frame this way. If you have a different frame, such as an 8-foot continuum or a hoop frame, you're going to have to be kind of creative when it comes to placing your border design. I would advise possibly breaking it into sections so that you can quilt part of the design, then move forward and quilt the next part of the design. That can work really well too if you have issues with the border not being perfectly straight across in the frame. And this is something that I struggled with whenever I got to the bottom edge. I went on ahead and quilted this border once, and I found that my bottom edge wasn't perfectly straight. It was kind of frowny, and that means that the corners of the quilt, the sides, were drooping downwards, and the middle of the quilt had pulled upward so that the bottom edge of the quilt was kind of forming a frown. Well, I did a little bit of creative fiddling on the frame and on the quilt, and I started playing around with these quilt clips. You might be wondering why I have them on the frame when most of the quilt's already quilted. Well, the reason is they can put a little extra tension on the quilt so that if you have a line such as this border and it's seeming to want to pull upward in the middle and downward in the corners, what you can do is you can take these quilt clips and place them so that you have one or two right in the center and just give them a little rotate so that they pull down on the quilt by 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch. It's not considerable, but it's enough to pull that frown down into more of a straight line. Now, if you have the opposite issue, such as the corners drooping downward, you might want to pull those up a little bit. You can do that by placing a quilt clip here on the back rail and giving that a little rotate. I can say that it's not quite as good. You can't get quite the same amount of tension as you can here on the front, but it does do a little bit, and it helps to straighten that out a little bit. So I'm just going to be perfectly honest. My quilt didn't end up perfectly straight and you have to just figure out how to fix it. Whatever you end up with in the end, you just have to kind of troubleshoot your way through it. I did a good bit of ripping, meaning I stitched the design and then I saw it was kind of veering downward as my design came and hit that frown, that higher part of the border. The design started veering into the bottom edge, and I noticed that, so I ended up ripping that out. And this is just one of those things. It takes trial and error, and the more quilts you do, the more borders you stitch, the better you're going to get at it. Okay, so now it's time to actually start planning and designing our border, and you're going to need a tape measure for this because you want to know the full length of that border minus the corner blocks. and that is coming out for me at about 70.5 inches. Remember, whenever we set our safe area, we set our safe area to the full width of the frame, from as far as you can go to the left to as far as you can go to the right. Well, when you're quilting this border, we want to design it and size it to the size we actually want within this space, so that way we can make sure it's going to look good. So whenever I go in to plan this, I want to use 70.5 for the width. And as far as the height, again, I don't like to take a design and max it out in that space, because I just think that it just doesn't look as good to me whenever a design is packed in there and going all the way from the top to all the way to the bottom. Also, because we might have a little bit of variation in the straightness of the border, it helps to make the border design more narrow. That hides it a little bit more than if you max it out, in which case it's pretty obvious whenever the border isn't straight, because the design ends up either bleeding into the main quilt or bleeding off the edge. So for this reason, I'm going to size my border at 5 inches tall. Now you have got a total of 6.5 inches of space here in this border to quilt in, so that might seem really narrow. But I'm going to actually stitch a straight line within the border, a 1/4 inch away from the bottom edge and a 1/4 inch away from the top edge. So that little bit of echo ditching, it's a 1/4 inch space line, really adds that little extra bit of border in the border, and it also helps to hide that subtle variation if your design doesn't fit perfectly. So again, I'm going to size this within a space 70.5 by 5 inches tall. So let's go in the software, I'll show you how to do it. So I'm going to tap on Pantograph because we want a continuous line design, and I'm going to change this total width to 70.5. Then I'm going to change the total height to 5 inches. So there we go, that is the space that we're working in. So now I'm going to select Pattern, go into Continuous Line, and dial down to Pattern A. Hit Open, and as you can see, this loads in only one design, which is massive. So we want to keep adding until these look good, and it really is entirely up to you how many you want to place. I look at 8 across that space. Now I like this look for many reasons. It looks like a nice paisley or teardrop shape. They're well formed without being too packed together. Of course, I could go up to 10, but you can see they start to get a little on the squished side, a little bit less proportional. But it's entirely up to you, and this might be something to try stitching out on scrap fabric, just to see what it looks like and experiment with these designs. I know I've been going through my QCT and stitching out designs just on scrap fabric just to see what they look like when they're in a nice kind of square or rectangular shape, and then when they get squished together, just to see what happens. So this is what looks good to me. Again, my settings are 70.5 for the total width. My total height is 5. The pattern width, it comes from the number of patterns divided by the total width. So that is calculated by the software to be 8.812. And then my pattern height is again 5. So this looks good. I'm very happy with it. I'm going to hit Place as Single Pattern. So on this screen, we work our placement, and I'll be honest, I don't like the 4 points placement method for borders. I just find it a little harder to place it exactly where I want it without it accidentally getting wider than I wanted. And then I'm also going to be stitching some straight lines in this border too, so it might actually be hard to use the 4 points method accurately. So instead, I'm going to dial up to 2 points, and I'm going to have this mark out on the start point and end point, meaning all I need to do is figure out the midpoint of the border, and that's going to be my start point over here, and the midpoint of the border on this side, and that's going to be my end point. So once I place that, then I'm sure that the border itself is not going to change shape. Here I can check on these, show grid, and show pattern size, and you can see the height is 5.002. I don't want that to change. With that other placement method with 4 points, If I placed this and had those points stretch out further, you know, maybe I forgot what I was doing and I had the placement be, you know, far on the edge of the border over here. You can see I told you that this whole border is 6.5 inches. So let's say I forgot and I placed my foot right here for that placement node. Well, I would be stretching that border to 6.5 inches tall, and that's not what I want. I want the border to be 5 inches wide, and I want it to be fitted here right in the middle of the space. So what I'm going to do to find that midpoint guide, I told you the size here is 6.5 inches. That's the full height of the border. I'm going to place a mark here at 3.25 because that is the midpoint of this height. That's going to be my start point on this side. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Measure 3.25, make a mark. That's your start and end point. And that's going to ensure that the design stays 5 inches tall. Here's 5 inches on this ruler, and it's going to be centered here nicely within this space. And I think that's going to look great. So I'm going to dial up to 2 points here, start point, roll the machine over. I showed you how I made that mark. I'm going to line it up so that my needle is right on the edge between the green block, the green square, and the orange border, lining up right with that mark. And I'm going to tap that first node, and we're going to wheel all the way over to the other side. And I've already measured and marked this point here. You can see that is the exact midpoint and the height of this border. So it measures 3.25 inches from the bottom, 3.25 inches from the top. That's where that's placed. Line up my foot, my needle exactly with that spot, and I tap that node. So I have the pattern placed, but what if I'm worried that it's not straight? Something's up with the quilt and I've just placed it and it's going to be diagonal in some glaring way. Well, make sure that all these little check boxes are checked so that you can show grid, show pattern size, and show placement nodes. They're really, really helpful to see the grid specifically. Then you can use these buttons at the top to zoom in so that you can see that design closer up on the screen in relation to the grid. And I can see it's veering ever so slightly upward, but I don't think it's going to be dramatic enough for it to really be noticeable on the quilt. It's very subtle. But always double check that. You can zoom in quite a bit with this software to be able to see how things are looking and proportional. And that will give you an idea of, you know, hey, I might want to go back and fiddle with that a little bit, maybe fiddle with the quilt a little bit. There's a little bit of a frown in the quilt. Remember, use these quilt clips, pull these into the center, and just give them a little bit of a rotate that pulls down the center of the quilt, bringing that frown down. And then you can also take quilt clips and place them to the back here, give that a little bit of a rotate. Like I said, it doesn't do quite as much, I think partly because of my idler rail here in this situation, but it can give that a little bit of a tug there on the leader cloth to pull up the side. So that way the frown, that's what it typically ends up doing. It kind of pulls downward and harder on the sides versus the middle, and that'll kind of level it out a little bit. Okay, I'm happy with this. I think it looks good. I'm ready to go. So I'm going to hit quilt and we're going to start stitching out this border. And this is definitely going to be a time at this point to stop and check your bobbin. Do not start stitching a long border like this and without a full bobbin in your bobbin case, because it just adds a whole nother element when you have to do a repair pattern and fix it. And I already know my bobbin's running a little bit low. So I'm going to change that out real quick and then we'll start stitching. Don't forget to pull your machine over to the side to do a little bit of a tension test every time you change your bobbin or your thread. So I've changed my bobbin and I ran the machine for a little bit over here on the side just to do a little tension test. And this is a good habit to get into. Every time I change my bobbin, change thread, change needle, or change foot, meaning anytime I change the foot height of my foot or the type of foot that I'm using, I pull the machine over to the side off the quilt and I do a little tension test, because all of those things can affect your stitch quality. All of those things can affect how things are threaded and feeding. And at any point in time, I could have made a mistake with my threading, I could have missed a guide, and that would have thrown off my stitching. I'd much rather figure that out off the edge of the quilt than when I start my border design, right? So always do that little bit of a check-in before you start stitching something big like this. So again, I'm going to hit pull bobbin to pull the bobbin thread up to the surface. You might wonder why I bother doing that and why I emphasize it so much. It's mostly because when you leave the bobbin thread on the back of the quilt, it can get stitched over and become a big nasty wadded up mess on the back of the quilt. It's not all that pretty. So this is one of those things I think is really important, to always pull your bobbin thread up to the surface. So now that both of those thread tails are in my hand, ready to go, I'm going to hit sew. And this is going to take a little while to stitch out. And I have had some questions from my students and customers over the years, and that is, at what point can you walk away from the frame? I don't think it's a good idea. I think you should at least stay in the room with the machine running, with it stitching out something this long. You want to keep your eyes on it. As you're stitching, you want to make sure that the design is staying straight. If you need to make a little small adjustment as you go, you can. And then just in general, you don't want to walk away from especially a Qnique long arm, because there isn't any sort of alert or beepy noise or anything like that if you run out of thread or something breaks. You won't know until you walk back in the room and the machine's on one end and your stitching stops somewhere in the middle. So I think in general, this is going to be something you want to just hang out and monitor it. If you have another machine, I have an embroidery machine in here, I might go stitch some embroidery while this runs out. But yeah, it takes a little while, but it's one of those things that it's kind of fun to watch it and just let it stitch out and take its time, and you can enjoy maybe doing some piecing in the corner, and that'll work out great. Now, as this stitches out, if you're worried about it staying straight across the border, what you want to do is just measure real quick from the top of the design to the top edge of the quilt. And I've got a little bit less than 1 inch, let's say 7/8 of an inch. So if I'm worried that that border design is not perfectly straight across, I can just measure as I go, and I know if the design is getting off a little bit, if I need to adjust these quilt clips a little bit, pull the quilt down a bit. So far, this is looking great, and I'd say it's really good to check in on the quilt before you actually start doing the stitching and try and get it as straight as you possibly can. Now, one thing I just recently added, I've been in construction this whole year because of big flood and basement remodel, and I ended up with a lot of really cool construction tools. And one that I have added to the wall here is a laser light. This is a vertical and horizontal laser light that I found at my local hardware store. And I'm now turning that on and shooting a straight line across the frame and getting a perfectly straight line to work off of, to know if things are straight on my frame. So that might not be for everybody, but it's something I wanted to add because it's a lot of fun to use different tools, and not necessarily quilting tools. And then it's also fun to be able to know if your quilt is absolutely perfectly straight without having to do anything else fiddly on your frame or on your machine or with the software. I can just turn the light on, make sure that it's straight, because I can actually run off of the lines on my ceiling tiles. Those are straight, so I can line it up with that, and then I'm sure that my design is straight on the quilt. So one of those fun things, you just have to be creative and see what you can use. You might have something in your toolbox that can be put to use for long arm quilting as well. So the longer borders are complete. I took the quilt off of the frame, trimmed it up a little bit, and I have reinstalled it in the frame, so now I can quilt the shorter border. And the very first step is to measure this length again, so that way we know how much space we're working in and what we need to design with. And this measures 40 1/4 from the green squares in the corners. So I have 40 1/4 in length. And remember the height, I like that design to be nicely centered in that border and a little bit more narrow. So I'm going to quilt that at 5 inches tall. So let's go ahead and set this up in the software so you can see how to design your shorter border. So let's start over just so you know how to get to the right screen. We're going to click on Pantograph, and this is the screen that we end up with. And I've already set my new safe area, and it's pretty big. It's 57 by 13. So I'm going to change that total width to 40.25. That's 40 and a quarter. And then I'm going to change my total height to 5. So that is the space I want to work in. Now I can click select pattern here or select pattern up here. And I'm going to look for that pattern A again. Open it. And I'm going to add more patterns until I like the look of it. And I like 5. I think that looks really nice. It has about the same scale, meaning the same distance between these lines as when we had the longer border and we had 8. So I think this is going to look consistent with the rest of the design, but again, you can add more, you can add less. It's entirely up to you and what you think is going to look best. And if you're wondering, okay, is it exactly the same size as the border before? Just take a look at your pattern width and pattern height. You have your total width and total height. That's the total space that you're working in. Your pattern width is the number of patterns divided by your total width. And remember, before it was, I think 8.812. It was a pretty weird number, but it was basically 8 inches and a little change. Well, again, we have 8 inches and a little change here and 5 inches. So I think this is going to be almost exactly the same shape, might be ever so slightly smaller, but it's not going to be enough for you to notice. So now we're going to hit place a single pattern. And again, we're going to use the 2-point method to place this. I have already marked the spot on my quilt. And remember, I measured this full width of the border, and that's 6.5 inches. I measured down from the top 3 1/4, made a mark. That is where I'm going to line up my needle, right on that edge between the green and the orange, and right on that mark. And that's where I'm going to hit that node. So that's my start point. Now we're going to wheel it all the way over to the other side. And again, I'm going to line this up really nicely. 3 1/4 inches from the top and bottom. And that looks good. And I hit my end point. So that looks great. Now I'm going to click on Show Grid and Show Pattern Size. Make sure that this is looking nice and straight across, because that would tell me if I'm seeing that this is veering within the software itself, then that would be telling me that maybe my border isn't installed straight. But now that I have the grid in place and I can see that grid in relation to my design and how I placed it on the quilt, this looks really nice and straight. I see that it's running along that grid line. I can zoom in using that button. And I think this looks great, so it's ready to stitch. So I wheel the machine back to the start point and then I hit quilt. And we're going to pull bobbin and watch this stitch out once more. So I'll hit pull bobbin. Make sure that bobbin thread doesn't make a mess on the back of the quilt. And it's always nice to do this because you can always check your placement. Just like I said before in the second video, if you drop that needle down and it's not exactly where you want it to start, then you can go back, hit the back button, and reset that placement node until it's exactly where you want it to go. So I hit sew, and now this is going to stitch out. And just like before, I'm going to keep an eye on the design, making sure that it doesn't, as the first one stitches out, I'll kind of keep an eye on the placement, the distance between the highest point here and that area, and then the lowest point and the border here. And then I can just measure that distance and make sure it's consistent across the entire length of the border. So I just finished stitching out my shorter border, and that is it for our basket weave with QCT Quilt Along. I have learned so much in this process about placing designs, about designing with these continuous patterns, and about how to keep things straight and square and continuous within the frame. I know that there is so much more to play with when it comes to computerized quilting, and I can't wait to dive in and continue sharing new ideas with you. Of course, I hope that you will enjoy more videos in Grace Company's fantastic fall festival. Join in the fun, share your quilts in our quilt show, and have fun meeting new quilters from around the world. Until next time, let's go quilt!